Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about Agatha All Along, episode 7. It's called Death's Hand in Mine. So spoilers for the episode, and this is a Patreon sponsored review, so thank you to Alison for picking this show. This is an episode that focuses on Lilia, who turns out isn't dead, which isn't a surprise. I kind of assumed her and Jen would probably pop back up, but they do, and the episode revolves around her, and it's probably the most interesting episode from a structural point of view because it takes that character and kind of establishes that she kind of leaps through time in her mind and actually recontextualizes some moments earlier on in the season as moments where she actually goes back to in her head right now in this episode. So some weird lines or instances, there was one with Alice, for example, or one back in like episode 3 where she said, "I love you guys," and they come from a timeline perspective from this episode, and she's jumping through all that time. So it's an interesting sort of attention to detail and like setting up of this reveal that she's been bouncing around timeline wise, and it's getting more erratic as she sort of gets to near the end of her story, which seemingly is death at the end of this episode. Now you don't quite see her body land, but I think thematically I would feel cheated now if she isn't dead. Just purely because I think part of the reason why this episode works fairly well is because so much of her character and how it's set up in this story, and we see her as a young sort of teenager getting her first lessons hundreds of years ago, is that she always had fear of her power, of seeing the future. This is something that happened to her when she was younger, but she kind of shut it out and stopped herself from jumping around because she hated seeing people get hurt or die in the future and know when the end of certain people was coming. And so much of this kind of revolves around the idea of her being scared of her meeting her end, which is why the reveal, even though it's totally not surprising, that Rio is in fact death, comes from her perspective as she sees and realizes it, because she's nearing, presumably, her meeting with death in her true form, where she comes to get her body. And you know, Death's true form's got a bit of a... It's still Aubrey Plaza, but there's kind of a... And she's not in much of this episode, she's really only in this one little moment where we see her coming towards her and sort of, you know, revealing that she's Death. It's, how do I put it? It's like a sort of skull... Actually, do you know what it looks like? It looks a little bit like Dia de los Muertos, like, you know, the Day of the Dead, that stuff. It looks kind of like that, with the kind of the skull kind of makeup over the at least the lower half of her face. She's in kind of darkness as she's coming towards her. I think you can still see her regular sort of eyes, but she's got, whether it's meant to be makeup or more literal in this sense, but that's kind of what it looked like to me. I think this stuff worked fairly well, because it tied in the character's core fears with her resisting her power, but then kind of opening up to it. Things starting to make more sense as we start jumping around with her throughout the episode, and then ultimately into her death. Now, that's not to say that I don't have any nitpicks. There is one thing towards the end that I don't know was, I don't think was particularly set up, which is the trick she uses to beat the 7 witches, which they kept saying the 7 over and over again in this episode, and it kept making me think of like Homelander and his team from The Boys. They kept saying the 7 are coming, and I'm like, whoa, this show is changing quite suddenly, all of a sudden. But she beats the 7 witches by turning the gravity upside down in the tower by flipping the tarot card. The entire trial that they're going through, which starts off as just Billy and Agatha, ends up involving those two, and it's kind of fun how it reveals that they get involved, because we actually jump ahead in time and see that they're already there. Then it goes back and sort of shows you them filling that in, and we all get the timeline from Lilia's perspective. So Lilia gets frustrated that Jen already knows certain things because she's already told her. But later on in the episode, we get to see when she told her that and the context of what she found out in the first place. Like, it does flow quite well, despite how complicated it sounds. Admittedly, me trying here to, like, recount the exact order of how we saw things would be impossible. Without going through and taking extensive notes, there's no way I'd ever be able to say, oh, this is when we found this out, and then this, and then this, and then this. Not a chance. It's too backwards and forwards, but I will make it clear that it makes complete sense when you're watching the episode. It's structurally very sound in that regard. But what I was getting at with the gravity flipping, though, is that was just one of those things where they did set up the tower card, but I don't think there was anything to suggest that flipping it over would literally flip the gravity. in the trial. And she sort of does that knowing it's going to work, and we get this big dramatic moment of all the seven like falling to their death onto the swords that were falling from the ceiling. Originally, you know, the ceiling was coming down with all these swords. Some would fall down, some were just staying in the ceiling as the ceiling was lowering. So when the gravity flips upside down, they fall and land on the swords. Makes sense, and the final big moment here is her kind of like falling in slow motion. Lilia tried to hang on to the table, but didn't quite, and seems to be dying, but with the comfort of knowing that she fulfilled her purpose. You know, the last thing she says to the main team is to Jen. She says that she loved being a witch, and it feels like she's kind of like appreciating like what her time meant and all that. And there's a lot of other things, of course, as she like, because they go through the episode thinking they have to do Teen or Billy's readings with the tarot cards, but it turns out to be her own readings that she needs to do, and all the cards represent other characters in the show, and they tend to reveal things about stuff that's already happened, stuff that's coming up in the show, and stuff that she needed. For example, one of the cards was about how she needed a coven. She needed, you know, companionship. She needed people to share her voice with. One references what already happened with Alice in a previous episode. One hints ahead that Jen's got like a lot of power that she's maybe unwilling to use yet. She also at one point says to, I think it's to Agatha, she says, "Duck when she calls you a coward," which no doubt will come up in the next 2 episodes, which are both next week, if I remember correctly. So we've got that coming next time. So for the most part, though, this was very good. Like the gravity flipping thing did feel a little bit like an out of nowhere thing for me, and that's typically something I usually just don't like about magic, is that, oh, just in the moment she explains that this can happen and it happens. It was not something that was set up, and it feels satisfying because it was set up earlier, and we can kind of like understand why it's happening and predict why it's happening. It's just because it's magic, and I find that a little bit unsatisfying. But that aside, I can't really complain about how the episode is put together. I guess my only sort of thing that I would say that's going to sound a bit negative is mostly just like, just the general idea that because I'm not loving the show that much, because I don't care about the characters that much, I don't think this episode hit me emotionally or hit me as hard as I seem to. It seems like a lot of people are really loving this episode. The rating on IMDb is like super high. It feels like this is resonating with people who like the show quite a bit, and I can kind of get it because it is probably the best episode of the show. But I think the part of what's making it work for everyone is because they're already kind of into the characters, and the emotion of like this ending of Lilia's story and her fulfilling and not feeling the fear for the first time in her life and being willing to save the others, and it ended on that moment where she, as a young girl, goes to get her first lesson, and the older witch says, "Let's begin," and she smiles. This idea that the timeline is, you know, her whole life matters from start to finish. It doesn't matter that it's over now because it wasn't necessarily in order in the first place. It's, you know, the whole experience was worth something. Like there's a good solid thematic idea to the episode, and it is a very good thematic way to reveal the deaths thing with Rio. Like I said, it's not a surprise. It was pretty clear that that's where it was going with her. I was sad, of course, that she's not around in the episode all that much again. That's 2 in a row where she's basically been absent, barring one little brief appearance here, which I get how she doesn't fit into the plot here. Like, I get it. Same way that I got it last episode. But it's still missing her all the same as far as just adding a bit of spice to the character dynamics. Not that there's none in here that I didn't enjoy, particularly when Lilia is trying to ask Billy to ask a question for the tarot reading. Agatha keeps jumping in and saying, "Hey, ask how we get out of here." And Lilia's like, "Oh, it has to be something important to his life on Earth." And she's like, "I think it's pretty important that he get out of here. Ask her. Go on, ask her." That was a fun little bit. Them all being dressed as kind of classic witches. They may have even all been Disney witches, actually. I mean, I'm not super in the know. Jen was like the Snow White witch. Billy had like the Maleficent thing going on. Is that not also a Snow White thing? I feel like it is, but Jen was like the classic cartoon version of the witch, though, from Snow White. Agatha, I think, was meant to be... well, no, because she's probably from Wizard of Oz, right? The Green Witch? That's probably Wizard of Oz that's meant to be, so that's not Disney. But regardless, they're all sort of more classical entertainment witches. You know, Agatha's in the full green paint and all the rest of it. So, like, all that's playing out, and there is a little bit of banter here or there, backwards and forwards between them. For the most part, this episode doesn't focus on that, though, because it's more about following Lilia's story. But there is some things that spring up in these moments. For example, when we finally get the start of the journey underground, because that's where Lilia and Jen are before they meet up with the others, they're walking underground, but there's like yellow vines or roots in the ground that are leading them where to go. There's a couple of things here, particularly when we get the start of it, because we don't get it in order, of course, but when we get the start of it, there was literally a fork in the road where there was a way back to the real world. There was like a subway station, like out of a hole, basically. And Jen has a choice to leave. That maybe it's the best option right now is just to go home. And Lilia basically says, hey, I hope you come because you're my sister in craft, and kind of like gives her a little speech. And Jen does make an active choice to stick with the group because she will be needed because she's important, or she feels like she's important. Or whatever. Like it was good though, regardless of the reasoning, which I think you could sit and debate on. The point is that it felt like some agency in the moment to make this choice. You know, because back at the start of the show, all the characters were kind of, yeah, obviously they all had motivations for coming on the trip down the road, but at the same time they were kind of goaded into it by another character. It is nice to have some of them take moments to, like, with their own agency, truly decide they want to commit to the path that they're on. And that felt like a moment there for Jen. And it feels like Jen, we haven't had an episode that is primarily focused on her. Alice had one. Lilia just had one. Obviously, Billy's had one. It feels like the penultimate episode is probably going to be Jen focused, if I was to guess. And then the finale would be just wrapping up everything that's going on. That would be my guess. But I mean, I'm just guessing. So I don't know, but yeah, it's a better episode. Probably the best episode it's had from just a raw craft perspective. It's kind of funny for me though, because I'm not as into the characters as much, so the emotion of it didn't quite hit. Is that I think objectively this is the best episode, but because of where I am and feeling about the show as a whole, I'm trying to find a way to describe it. It's not so much that I enjoyed a couple of the earlier episodes more, but it's almost more like my opinion of the show is cemented over the past several episodes. So now it's like, oh, this is better, this is solid, but it's not doing enough to move my needle, if that makes sense. That sounded dirtier than I meant. So move the needle, move the needle on my meter. You know what I'm trying to say. It's I don't know. It's a weird one to sort of come in and talk about and critique at this point, because I feel like I feel a certain way, and I don't think the show is going to really change any of my opinions on that. Really, just based on what the main focus of the show was and everything else. But I do think this is a really solidly put together episode in terms of its structure, in terms of how it plays with time, and how it kind of gives a character an ending to their story that felt like, at least over the course of this episode, it really established kind of her earlier fears and how she kind of has lived as a bit of a solo, a loner her whole life, because if she gets close to someone, she might see how their life ends before it actually does, and that's made her kind of like resist being in groups, resist being in a coven and all these things, and have her sort of realize that and sort of like kind of commit to everyone around her by the end by embracing it and ultimately saving their lives by successfully completing the trial. Which, by the way, before we actually get into all the main stuff in the episode, there is a little bit with Agatha and Billy at the start where Billy flat out accuses her of never been on the road before, and her reaction to that definitely felt like she was hiding stuff. Like she definitely takes a moment to pause. So even if she has been on the road before, there's definitely something more to that, where that accusation kind of hit her. So there's a good chance she actually wasn't on the road, and maybe we'll see how whatever the backstory is here that they're probably revealing next week. We'll see, but worth mentioning. Yeah, they also addressed that Rio's not around, and Agatha just says she doesn't want to talk about it. I guess the idea is that she's still just kind of feeding off Alice's body or something. You know, not physically, but in a soul-consuming kind of sense. I guess that's what's happening. I don't really know, but certainly Agatha does not seem surprised or worried that Rio is not around. If anything, it sounds like she just knows where she is, and it's like, I'm not going to answer that question. But I mean, we'll see. It won't be that long till we find out, I guess. I do hope that Rio has more of a presence in the last episode. You know, beyond just showing up and being a scary thing that might, you know, kill them or at least enjoy when they die. Like, I hope she actually gets to interact with them and gets to actually banter with them and talk to them and give some of that life to the show. And actually, one of the interesting bits from Billy's story, actually, in this episode, it's something I kind of complained about last week, was this idea of, like, it didn't seem like that he cared that he had these two loving parents who did seem to be very good to him, all things considered, and had no idea he'd changed places with someone else. There is a moment in this episode where he says to Agatha, he basically says, oh, Wanda's not really my mother, I have a mother. At least that was the implication from what he said. And that wasn't the exact sentence. But when Agatha referenced Wanda as his mother, he said, she's not my mother, I have a mother, which sounds like he's talking about the mother of the couple that were, you know, literally looking after him. You know, the parents of the person whose body he went into originally. But even later in the episode, the question he asks when they think it's about his tarot readings, he asks, am I Billy or am I William? And they're like, oh, that's a good question. Like, they literally say that out loud, that's a good question. So this is definitely setting up in this episode that he's having a bit of an identity crisis. There's kind of like, who am I more of? Am I more the person who this body belonged to before? Or am I, you know, Wanda Maximoff's son? And clearly that struggle is fine. I think that's an interesting place to take it. I wish we felt that a little bit more last episode. Because I didn't really come out of that episode feeling like he was this conflicted. But I do think it makes sense. I think it makes sense to have this sort of this sense of identity that's kind of missing, that he needs to overcome and figure out who he is. And I mean, that ultimately could be the heart of the show. And if it is the heart of the show, then I almost think that maybe they should have brought the idea up a little bit sooner and like really got us into the idea of like he's conflicted about who he really is if he really does have a brother that he wants to save, because that was the thing. That's, you know, the end of the last episode, it felt like that was the definite goal from him, was to find the brother. But maybe the goal's more just of like an answer of like who he really is. Like, is he this one person or the other? Is he a bit of both? And is he a new person because he's a mix of both? And what does that mean? How does he process that, comprehend it? I mean, you know, if this show is ultimately about kind of people dealing with their own identity crisis, whatever it may be, because Alice kind of had that with you know, the whole backstory of her mother and sort of realizing who she is and who her mother was. This episode with Lilia kind of like realizing that she'd been kind of like running away from her true potential, and that she's kind of like intentionally cordoned herself off from other people, and that's let her live a certain life because of it. You know, and even Agatha to an extent, you know, I'm sure in a much broader scope, like her doing literally put her in a prison, right? She literally ended up in a mind prison from Wanda because of what she'd been doing as a witch. It feels like, you know, this is people dealing with their issues in the most broad way to put it. So, yeah, I mean, maybe these things all link up quite well thematically by the time we get a real sense of what everyone's going through. But, yeah, which is why I'm expecting there to be a little bit more fleshing out of Jen's story, because it has mostly kept her at arm's length thus far, so I suspect that she'll get an episode out of the last two. Probably not the finale. I would be surprised if it was the finale, but alright, well there you go. That's my rambles on this week's Agatha All Along. Yeah, good. I think objectively it's pretty good. I would say that I don't think I got that much of an emotional impact from it, but I don't know if that's just purely because I was already kind of tuned out emotionally from the show from fairly early on. So, you know, if anyone who actually really cares about the show is still listening to me blab on about it, by all means, let me know what you thought of the episode in the comments. And of course, you can like, subscribe, ding the bell, support over on Patreon, all those things help out a bunch. Thank you very much for joining me. I will see you next time. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?